I want to go ahead and take the opportunity to, of course, congratulate Anna on this award, but also to thank all of the people who've organized this. My name is Amie Kreppel. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida. And our task today is very minimal. We are hosting and assisting in the celebration as passive guests. So once the discussion begins, I will probably turn off my video. But I do want to give some administrative notes to the folks who are participating in this. We will be primarily using the Q&A forum. So we would encourage all participants, all attendees, to use the Q&A box to ask their questions rather than the chat function. The chat function is less well monitored and less available to all of the panelists. So please feel free to add your questions there, and our moderator today, Robert Blobaum, will manage that. And I will hand it over to you now, Robert, to make the formal introductions to all of our guests. I am very much looking forward to being able to sit back in and listen to all of the conversations that will happen.
Thank you, Amie. And I'd like to thank you and the Center for your willingness to co-host this event and to advertise it, and for managing this Zoom platform. So thank you very much. And to everyone else, good day, dzień dobry, good evening, dobry wieczór. My name is Robert Blobaum, and I'm a professor of history at West Virginia University and the president of the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences of America, better known as PIASA. This is the grand finale of several virtual events that we have been hosting featuring our award recipients. And these awards were established by PIASA in 1995 to recognize outstanding contributions to history, the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the applied sciences. The Bronislaw Malinowski Social Sciences Award is named for the pioneering anthropologist and first president of PIASA, Bronislaw Malinowski. The Malinowski Award recognizes a scholar in one of the fields of the social sciences who has written a book or seminal publication of exceptional value and significance dealing with an aspect of the Polish experience. In past instances, the Malinowski Award has also recognized a scholar's outstanding body of published work. The book, outstanding publication or body of work, should represent exemplary scholarly research published in the fields encompassed by the social sciences, including anthropology, economics, political science, and sociology, according to standards recognized by those fields. The book, publication, or body of work must be written in the English language. The 2020 Malinowski Committee was chaired by Michael Bernhard, and it also included Małgorzata Mazurek, Jeffrey Kopstein, and Jason Wittenberg. Based on that committee's recommendation, it's my distinct honor to recognize formally and in virtual person Professor Anna Grzymala-Busse as the 2020 Malinowski Award recipient for her many contributions to the field of Polish studies. So congratulations, Anna. Now, at this point, the plan was to turn the Zoom podium over to Michael Bernhard, the Raymond and Miriam Ehrlich Chair of Political Science at the University of Florida. But Michael's been called away to attend to a family matter. He has, however, given me the following laudation to read on behalf of the committee. So here we go. Anna Grzymala-Busse is presently the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies, Director of the European Center, and Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. She is an expert in political parties, religion and politics, regimes and regime change, and research methods. She has previously held positions at Yale University and the University of Michigan. Anna's contributions to Polish studies have been unique because she studies Poland in relation to other countries. In much of her area-centered work, Poland serves as one of her cases, which she compares to other countries. In her early work, much of this comparison was in regard to the V4 countries, including Slovakia, Czechia, and am I missing?
Hungary.
I'm sorry, Hungary. But recently it's been in relation to a broader sample of European cases. In this way, Anna's work has allowed us to appreciate what is unique and singular about Poland's developmental trajectory, but also the degree to which it conforms to patterns that exist within Europe and even globally. In this sense, she has helped us to contextualize the Polish experience and integrate it more broadly in social scientific understanding while doing full justice to all of its richness. Anna is the author of 3 books. Most recently, Nations Under God, How Churches Use Moral Authority to Influence Policy. This was published by Princeton University Press in 2015, and it won 3 different awards. 2 from the American Political Science Association, 2 separate sections, the Lubert Prize for Best Book in Comparative Politics, and the European Politics Sections Prize for Best Book, but also the Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies for Best Book in Politics and History. The book explains the role that religion can play in democracy through a paired comparison of 6 different cases: Italy and Ireland, Poland and Croatia, the US and Canada. It is a prime example of how the Polish experience helps us to understand the diversity of roles that churches can play under democracy and how different churches had greater or lesser roles in democratic politics. In her first 2 books, Anna compared Poland to the other V4 countries to understand key issues in the transition from communist dictatorship to democracy. The first of these was Redeeming the Communist Past, the Regeneration of Communist Successor Parties, published by Cambridge University Press in 2002. This book was important because it explained how post-communist politicians had succeeded in winning power democratically soon after transition to democracy in places like Poland and Hungary. The second was Rebuilding the Leviathan, Party Competition and State Exploitation, which was also published by Cambridge University Press, this time in 2007. It won the 2008 Ed Hewitt Prize for the best publication on the political economy of the former Soviet Union and East Central Europe from the Association for Slavic and East European and Eurasian Studies. The book explained variation in the ways that the post-communist state was rebuilt across the V4 and establishes that leaner, more efficient states are a product of the competitiveness of the party system. Finally, Anna is the author of dozens of peer-reviewed articles. They are published in a variety of journals with disciplinary and area impact. And 4 of these articles were also awarded prizes. Today, Anna will share with us her thoughts on the state of contemporary Poland. She will be joined in this conversation by 2 distinguished scholars in their own right, Genevieve Zubrzycki and Monika Nalepa. Genevieve Zubrzycki is professor of sociology at the University of Michigan, where she directs the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. A historical and cultural sociologist, her scholarship focuses on the relationship between national identity and religion, collective memory and national mythology, and the contested place of religious symbols in the public sphere. Zubrzycki is the author of 2 award-winning books, The Crosses of Auschwitz, Nationalism and Religion in Post-Communist Poland, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2006, and also with the University of Chicago Press 10 years later in 2016, Beheading the Saint, Nationalism, Religion, and Secularism in Quebec. Her third monograph, which is coming in 2022, is analysis of the ongoing revival of Jewish communities in Poland and non-Jewish Poles' interest in all things Jewish. Monika Nalepa is an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago. With a focus on post-communist Europe, her research interests include transitional justice, parties and legislatures, and game theoretic approaches to comparative politics. Her first book, Skeletons in the Closet, Transitional Justice in Post-Communist Europe, was published in the Cambridge Studies of Comparative Politics series in 2010. And it too received 2 Best Book Awards from separate sections of the American Political Science Association. Her current work centers on how transitional justice mechanisms contribute to the quality of democracy. A centerpiece of it is the Global Transitional Justice Dataset, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. Her next book, After Authoritarianism, Transitional Justice and Democratic Stability, is coming out with Cambridge University Press in 2022. Let us hope there is an after to an authoritarianism. So, Monika, would you like to begin?
Thank you so much, and congratulations, Anna. It's truly a pleasure to see you receiving this award. I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to over a decade ago, almost 2 decades now, when you published Redeeming the Communist Past, and I read that book as a graduate student and couldn't set it down. So what I wanted to start with is ask you, from the perspective of years that have passed since its publication, do you still think that it was predominantly the usable skills of members of the former communist parties that allowed them to adapt to democratic conditions, or and to what extent was it, the resources that they had stashed away and the networks that they could mobilize when needed that helped them survive for as long as they did? Because I think they outlived even your expectations in terms of their survival.
Thank you for that question, and above all, thank you so much to PIASA. First of all, to you, Bob, for that very kind introduction, to PIASA for an award by which I'm deeply honored and delighted, and to my good friends Monika and Genevieve for participating in this conversation, and to everyone for coming here. So to cast our minds back all the way to the former communist successors and how they transformed themselves, I think their usable skills allow them to both stash the resources and to transform the parties. And so in many ways, rather than an either or question, it's the skills that basically allowed them to survive as long as they did, and to stash away the resources that allowed their own individual survival. But I think the chickens came home to roost. And what happens when you look at 2000 or so is that these sort of newly empowered barons in the communist successor party in Poland, in the SLD, these newly empowered barons basically are creating their own sort of entities. They're creating their own sort of domains where they stash away money, they create their own corrupt deals. And having gained so much power within the party, they start to clash with sort of the center over these resources, over where the party is going. And that ultimately is what caused the party to crash. By 2004, the SLD is no longer an electoral entity, largely because of these internal contradictions and the fact that no amount of skill or resources will make up or compensate for an inability to speak to the voters and present a united, honest, transparent party.
Well, I'm going to follow up on a different book. I want to go back to Nations Under God, and see what, it's how many years now? It's your most recent, 5 or 6 now?
6.
Yeah.
It's time for another one.
Yes. So I wanted to know what you thought about the current state of not only the Catholic Church in Poland, with peace and power, and peace emboldened also by their electoral success. And given COVID and the recent women's movement that has really grown in importance, I mean, it could have been a movement that happened, a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, there were a first wave of women's strikes, but in this fall, in spite of COVID restrictions, etc., women really marched even more so. And so I was wondering what you envision, both in terms of the place of the church, but also the place of Catholicism in Poland. And I was looking at recent numbers that are pre-COVID and pre-marches, and they're actually starting to go down in a way that we haven't seen really in the early 2000s, and certainly not in the 1990s, when people might have expected that religiosity would have, gone down with the fall of communism. So the church, for example, is down to the 1992, 1993 lows with the recent debates over abortion. So, I mean, I don't want to ask you how to explain it, although your answer to my actual question might be the answer to that. But what do you see? I mean, do you see that it might be the beginning of the end, especially with generational change and when you look at youth numbers? Or what's your take on that?
Right. Well, one of the arguments I make in that book is that churches are politically most influential when they can make a credible claim to being above partisan interests, to be defenders of the common good, of the national interest, and so on. And when they're in that position, they don't have to form coalitions with parties. They don't have to beg the voters to vote for their preferred policies. They can simply conclude a whole bunch of backroom deals or have politicians enact their policy preferences in anticipation of the church's reaction. And that was the church of basically the 1990s in Poland. And some of that is dependent on levels of religiosity, but a lot of it is dependent on this image of the church as a national defender of the common good. And I think that has come under the gun. And especially with peace, what we see is more than ever sort of what churches do when they're slightly weaker, when they form a more explicitly political coalition with political parties. And that, I think, is the real danger, because the more closely aligned a church is with a political party, the less it can make a claim to being a representative of the national interest or the common good. And instead, it looks much more petty and partisan and frankly politicized. So I think and the church recognizes this danger, I think. It's been trying very carefully to speak in generalities and not to speak about peace. Peace is relying on the church more than vice versa. And so I think two things are happening right now. One is that you're absolutely right. The levels of church attendance, identification, and participation are going down, especially among young people. But that might be a cohort effect rather than a generation effect, right? And so as these people get older, they might go back to the church. The changes are not dramatic. This is not the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where over 10 years, you basically have the collapse of both faith and the institution.
But it could be the beginning of it.
It could be, but there's no evidence of that just yet. Of course, we never know the avalanche until it actually starts, right? I think for the church, it still enjoys an enormous amount of institutional respect within the Polish state and government. If there's a reaction to what's happening on the ground, it'll be a lagged one. But I think it's telling that the church has now repeatedly sort of waged a culture war in order to deflect attention from its own its own corruption and its own sort of scandals. So when we saw the first pedophilia scandals arise in 2000, the church basically raised the specter of gender ideology. And now with more scandals that are coming out, both about pedophilia and the finances of the church, you have both the church and peace waging a war against LGBT ideology. And in both cases, it's an assertion of both traditional Poland and traditional church teaching, but the ultimate goal is to deflect basically attention from what the church is doing and the ways it's failed to live up to the ideals that it stated should apply to everyone. And I think the Women's March, to a large extent, expresses some of that frustration. But when will they stop, right? And what was telling with the Women's Marches isn't that they took place in cities. We would expect that, but you saw small villages everywhere. Women were protesting. So I think there is a sort of an untapped well of resentment and frankly, just frustration at the degree to which both the church and the peace have overreached.
If I could just follow up on that a little bit. So one of the features of the Polish electoral system is that elections are held on Sundays. So there's just this institutional underpinning of church influence, right? Which I think, goes to what you were saying, that peace needs the church more than the church needs peace. I mean, ultimately, the last voice that voters will hear before they head to the ballot boxes is the voice of the priest, provided that they go to that church. So there's a delicate balance there to be struck, I think. So when you say that there are people who are, when church attendance is going down, if this is permanent, that might spell the end of this alliance between the most national parties and the church. So one of my questions that I also had to you is whether this path towards the denationalization of Poland, the disempowerment of parties on the radical right, is through secularization.
Right. So two things. I think first on church politicking and electioneering. So first of all, I think elections happen on Sundays in many countries. I mean, the United States is kind of weird in that we have elections on a work day, right? They usually happen on the weekend anyway, and I don't think that necessarily gives an advantage to Christian parties or Christian democratic parties or even those favored by the church. And here, I think the church really learned some very bitter lessons in 91 and 93, where it explicitly stepped out, behind the pulpit and told people how to vote, especially in 91. And that really backfired. If you sort of see the approval of the church, basically, after that election, it just plummets. And so the church learned a lesson. And it doesn't sort of, the kind of days of open electioneering where, the priest would really hold up a list of which candidates to vote for are gone. It's considerably subtler than that. I think, again, with variation, right? Some village churches, I'm sure that it's more open. So I think the church has learned the lesson isn't sort of, as much about direct electioneering as it is about stepping back and sort of guiding the national conversation. And here, I think, what's interesting about the far right parties these days is that, they make use of this rhetoric of Bóg, ojczyzna, honor. But in fact, it's not a religious rhetoric at all. There's, the God here is sort of legitimizing whatever it is that they want, which is largely sort of, an anti-immigrant, pro-natalist, anti-sort of, abortion agenda, rather than some kind of any kind of a religious or spiritual direct connection. So they're basically sort of, trying to, the sort of invocation of the Holy Trinity is purely instrumental. There isn't sort of, any kind of benefit that they gain from, or any kind of linkages that they're trying to make to the church itself.
So this is interesting. So would you find that in line with the subtle influence rather than outright, being a mouthpiece of peace? Would you find that the drastic anti-choice law that was passed largely through the hands of the Constitutional Court is part of that? So like a few years before it was implemented by the Constitutional Court, it was brought into the Sejm through a citizens' initiative, which is a very rare form of legislative initiative. Most of the bills that get passed in Poland are actually submitted by private members who are typically members of the ruling party. So this was a bill that was placed on the agenda because of it garnered more than 500,000 signatures. And the only way in which peace aided it is that the Speaker of Peace did not stop it from being placed on the peace agenda. And already that was too much, right? So at the end, Duda vetoed that. I think it ended up with a Duda veto, unless my Duda vetoes are now getting confused. But anyway, it wasn't implemented then. But meanwhile, in the background, peace was rearranging the staffing of the top judicial institutions in the country. And what we see right after the peace re-election campaign of 2019 is this brand new, almost ready-made bill coming. Well, it wasn't really a bill, it was just a ban on the existing bill coming through the peace-staffed, peace-packed Constitutional Court. I mean, you can hardly get more subtle than that in fulfilling the church's agenda.
Well, it's the church's, it's not so much, yes, it's very much a church policy preference, but notice what happened, right? In 2016, when the bill first makes its way to Sejm, and Kaczynski does everything he can to basically make it go away, right? And basically the thing dies on the floor. And then he says that, well, of course, eugenic abortion is a very bad thing, but that's something for the future. And he basically doesn't want to deal with it in ways that would make him pay the political price and would peace pay the political price. And then what happens is, after the elections, this goes to the Constitutional Court so that peace can claim that it wasn't, the party that did this, it wasn't the government that did this, it was the Constitutional Tribunal. It was an independent, autonomous sector of the government, of the state, and peace can't bear any responsibility for it. So I think, in this particular case, I think, peace knows fully how unpopular this is. It wants to satisfy some of its very conservative and religious base, but doesn't want to pay the broader political price. And even though, the marches clearly blamed peace and the entire system for making this happen, that wasn't certainly, peace could claim that it didn't bear direct responsibility. What's also interesting was the church's reaction, right? The church stayed out of it. It did not defend the law. It wasn't making a huge, the usual kind of huge satisfactory statements that the church would. It was very cautious and it was very sort of reserved, surprisingly reserved in the degree to which it praised the tribunal's decision. So I think everyone is aware that this is so incredibly controversial and so tendentious that it almost sort of, it could backfire easily had it not been handled extremely carefully.
I want to ask you because your work is very comparative, always. So I want to pick your mind about what's going on in Poland, what's going on in other countries. You know, like Hungary and Poland are often compared as the two brothers, or perhaps they should be cousins, or what kind of twins if they're twins. So sorry. So how do you see the situation in Hungary and Poland? And there's different ways that we could think about those two. So in relation to the EU, but in addition to basically how they deal with politics and social issues in their own at home.
So, you know, my sort of thoughts on Fidesz and peace could be summarized by the fact that, you know, I think peace has all the authoritarian commitments of Fidesz, but half the competence. And you sort of see this happen over and over again. So, you know, I think Fidesz also enjoys a constitutional supermajority, which made it much easier for it to enact everything that it did. But even so, if you just look at, you know, abstracting some of the levels of actual parliamentary control, if you look at the way that Fidesz went about its agenda, it was very systematic. There were enabling laws. You know, the entire constitution was transformed over the, you know, rewritten and passed within for the first 6 months, and radically, systematically, and very coherently rewrote the entire system. Mm-hmm. And so what you have are, you know, the sort of attacks on the autonomy of the Supreme Court. You have a media law that basically severely limits the freedom of the media. You have a civil society law that basically makes it very difficult to register as an independent civil society organization and to survive as one because of tax laws and whatnot. The CEU is hounded out of the country, again, very thoroughly and systematically, and so on, right? And these are all sort of, you know, enacted with quote unquote the rule of law, right? I mean, these are a bunch of, you know, Fidesz are a bunch of lawyers, very well-trained lawyers, and they enact this sort of, you know, brilliantly, systematically, and very coherently. What happens in Poland? Peace goes after the Constitutional Tribunal and makes a hash of it, right? I mean, the laws are, you know, the sort of versions of the law in the Sejm and the Senate were conflicting. Nobody quite understood it. Małgorzata Gęsor shows up back to work, having been, you know, in effect fired, and no one does anything about it, right? The media law, you know, yes, of course, the state TV has now become basically a propaganda mouthpiece, but the government has not been able to control either the press or the other media, despite a lot of talks about the repolonizacja. That hasn't happened. Civil society continues to be vibrant and highly organized, and it's basically impossible to control. And the universities function as in pretty much the same way they have. In both cases, you have an opposition that's fragmented and unable to sort of get its act together and sort of effectively oppose the governing parties. But the difference is still that I think, you know, Fidesz is simply much more competent and much more systematic and coherent about enacting the same agenda that peace has been making a hash of in Poland.
So if I could follow up on that, is it lack of competence, or is it just a different strategy? Because when I look at peace, the amazing thing about that party is that, you know, in a span of 4 years or even less, maybe, it managed to dismantle these institutions that you wrote about in your second book, to come back to the middle, right. Rebuilding Leviathan, when you talked about the importance of building institutions that insulate the state from the possibility of extraction by political parties. And it seems that like peace has been systematically chipping away at just that. And to my surprise, who studies institutions, it's happened despite bicameralism, despite a parliamentary system, despite courts, and even despite the EU. So how is that possible that they succeeded in doing that? Were those institutions just not set up all the way? So in other words, the fact that the successor communist parties, the SLD and in various variations, you know, despite its resources and its networks, were not able to touch the state in the early 1990s. And peace comes to power and is able to do exactly that, and basically mobilize some of those state resources into their clientelistic machine. I know you don't like that word, so I should use some quotation marks.
No, that's totally fine. So I think, you know, there are sort of 3 things that I would like to say that protected the state in the 1990s and the early 2000s was a really robust party competition. Governments alternated, governments basically offered different, you know, slightly different versions. They were able to protect institutions by basically insulating them knowing full well they were likely to be kicked out of office in the next round and didn't want the next party to benefit too much. That was the kind of healthy process that I think largely stops in Poland, for example, with sort of the 8 years of Platforma governance starting in the mid-2000s. You just don't have the same kind of robust opposition. You have parties that grow complacent, and in the case of peace, you get a party that obtains a parliamentary majority as the first sort of single-party government in Poland's history. And here I think we come to the second sort of aspect of it, that it's that parliamentary majority, that sort of governing as a single party, means that there are no sort of coalitional partners who could hold back what peace is doing either, right? And in a parliamentary system where the executive and the legislative are fused, being a single governing party basically in effect makes you a dictator, subject to sort of vetoing by the court system, which of course they've now brought under their control as well. And third, I think it's critical that it's really interesting that you use the word chipping, because it's exactly that. This is not a whole-scale institutional replacement. This is kind of a chipping away that hasn't yet destroyed the foundations, but certainly has destroyed the upper stories. And so when you look at institutions like the Ombudsman, for example, right? In Hungary, those kinds of institutions either don't exist because they were eliminated, or they've become fully under parliamentary, i.e. partisan control. In Poland, that hasn't happened to the Ombudsman, for example, right? Instead, he's basically being thrown out of office because they're refusing to renew his term, even though a new sort of member, a new Ombudsman hasn't yet been found or appointed yet, right? And so traditionally that meant that the term would be extended. In his case, it's not being extended. But that's not, a systematic wholesale replacement. That's not a coherent strategy for the long term. That is exactly, it's chipping away rather than demolishing and building anew, which is what is happening in Hungary. So I think, again, and this may be a self-limiting strategy. This may very well be that, peace has decided it doesn't want to go the full, the whole hog. Or it might simply be an inability to actually figure out what it takes to replace these institutions wholesale and to bear the political consequences in the short term so you can consolidate authoritarian power in the long term. And that kind of decisiveness is, I think, missing in peace.
So, I mean, listening to you sound like much more optimistic or less alarmist than I might be, for example. Or so, can you tell us more about that? I mean, you're not more worried about what's going on in Poland? Isn't chipping away ultimately, you can chip away and basically do away?
Right. It's not that I'm not worried. It's that I'm noticing that, in Hungary, you have a fait accompli. You have a fully consolidated authoritarian regime that basically has enormous discretion to do what it wants within sort of entirely legal frameworks. And you have a regime that's basically been able to play the EU like a violin, largely because for a very long time, Fidesz was a member of the European People's Party, which protected it against all criticism. In Poland, it's not that, as I said from the outset, I think peace shares many of the same goals that Fidesz has. It's just not as competent in enacting them. Either it's not as competent, or it may have sort of a more limited understanding of sort of where it wants to go. But in both cases, I just don't see Poland going to full authoritarianism given all that's been happening so far, right? It's going to take a very long time to get there. And by that point, Kaczynski will have died. And when that happens, there'll be sort of a massive internal civil war within peace that he alone has been able to contain so far.
So what you're saying is that we're not facing plain hijackings quite yet in Poland.
No, we're nowhere near plain hijackings. What we are facing is a state that may not be rewarding competence enough so that the air traffic controllers may get into an accidental crash, but they're not going to be bringing down planes for the benefit of Vladimir Putin anytime soon. No.
So I would just point out that so you mentioned the long-term process, and you also mentioned the veto power of coalition partners as serving the same role as checks and balances do in presidential systems, and the lack of those checks and balances under peace rule. But I would encourage you to look a little bit more about Platforma's rule, which was the sort of the beginning of the move towards majoritarianism in Poland, and sort of like away from this consensus model. And so that's something that we've talked about before. But something that I've been wondering about lately is the role of the EU in this majoritarian push, because with the EU accession, which materialized in 2004, what happened was there was this huge amount of legislation that had to be passed in order for Poland to be an eligible candidate. And under the first Sejms, like the first term or the second term, where this process of back and forth between multiple parties just made for very low production rates of legislation, it would have been simply impossible. So, so to what extent did this EU nagging to implement all this huge body of legislation prompt PO towards majoritarianism, so that they're the more productive, competent party, therefore paving the way for PiS to very swiftly take advantage of those majoritarian institutions once it won elections?
So I would answer this in sort of a two-step fashion. One is that it's absolutely the case that Platforma made these had these majoritarian leanings. It also was incredibly complacent for the 8 years that it was in power, right? It didn't exactly sort of, this was not an institutional revolution. This was the politics of warm water, as Tusk so memorably put it. So I don't think, they may have laid the groundwork, but they certainly didn't take advantage of it. But I think the broader issue, the broader way in which the EU comes in here is that if you remember the run-up to the EU accession, this basically created an amazing elite consensus. The EU was presented, and EU membership was presented as an unalloyed good. This was the one thing that elites from all sides stood side by side, right next to each other and said, this is what we need, this is what Poland needs, this is what Hungary needs. In country after country, this was presented basically as the only way forward. Even the church during this time spoke out in favor of, EU membership as sort of, the desideratum, the sort of summum bonum of Polish nationhood. And what that did is basically limit the sort of the movement for any kind of critics of the process, right? And the process was highly contentious. I mean, Poland and every other accession country was basically asked to adopt wholesale the acquis communautaire. There was very little room for negotiation. There were almost no concessions other than freedom of labor movement with only 3 countries. So it was just an incredibly brutal process where an enormous amount was imposed on these countries willingly. And there were almost no critics. The critics were basically silenced and they were marginalized. And those critics that come to the fore after accession. I mean, the first, AWS government, the first, sort of what is now PiS, right? But the first sort of government of, the 3 kind of more sort of tendentious and appalling parties in Polish history is from 2005 to 2007, right? Samoobrona, the Liga Polskich Rodzin, and AWS, right? And that's in direct reaction to this consensus. And so I think that sort of, the elite consensus and sort of, basically made a lot of voters feel the parties are unaccountable and unresponsive and couldn't care less about individual voters or what they need. And that really sets the ground for parties like PiS and others to benefit hugely in the future. That actually sets the ground for kind of this populist resurgence across the new member countries, where basically the populists are the one set of critics that make, the one set of parties that criticize the EU accession process and benefit hugely electorally afterwards because of it. So I think the EU is a wonderful thing, but the process of EU accession leaves a lot to be desired.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yes, Anna, I don't know if you can see the question and answers, the Q&A, but there are some there. The first one from Janine Holtz.
Okay. Let's see, the party system and the long-term impact, right? So, I think PiS would very much like to do away with a multi-party system. It'd be a lot easier if it could continue to be the single party in power, which it has been since 2015. That said, the opposition is, a bunch of useful idiots for the party, right? Because the opposition keeps coming up, self-immolating, and in the process, making the PiS look like the only sort of viable political option. So I don't think PiS is going to really, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think PiS is eliminating multi-party competition, largely because it knows it's still the only game in town. There really isn't a credible alternative these days. And its policies, some of its policies are genuinely popular, like the family subsidy and others. Let's see, the next question about how the Polish government clashes with virtually all its neighbors. Right, well, that's, I don't think peace is alone in this. There have been other governments who also had problems with that. I think fundamentally, this is a question of diplomatic competence. Look who's in charge. When you have people like Waszczykowski who have led foreign policy in Poland, it's not surprising that it's difficult to arrive at any kind of an agreement or even sort of alliances with our neighbors, much less with the United States, with the EU, and so on. I think basically foreign policy in Poland is not run by people these days. This is not the era of Bartoszewski, right, or Mazowiecki, people who were true diplomats who really knew how to speak to other quote unquote men of state. And Poland is paying the price. Let's see, the role of the EU in the United States. Well, so, I think when it comes to stopping democratic backsliding, the international community has less to say about this than we would like. Obviously, what the EU could do and has not done is to basically stop the billions of dollars that flow to Poland and to Hungary and then make these two parties' governance possible. Poland, I think, now receives something like 13 billion euro a year. Hungary receives 5 billion euro a year. And that money not only funds policies that make the party popular, it also, in the Hungarian case especially, goes directly to the coffers of the ruling party officials. And so the EU could be much more stringent than it has been about enforcing the rule of law mechanisms that sort of flamed out so spectacularly in December. When it comes to the United States, I would say that most of the Polish political establishment is much more suspicious of Joe Biden than it was of Donald Trump. Sad to say, and so that makes the influence in Poland more tenuous. And I think, frankly, the time when the United States could sort of, dictate policy in Poland, if it ever existed, is long past. I don't think other sort of countries have much to say about how these countries either backslide or erode democracy further. Why the weakness of the Polish parties, the Polish opposition parties? So, I think Polish opposition parties have traditionally been weak. There's an enormous, Poland, I think, has one of the most fragmented political party systems for most of the 1990s and 2000s, right? There's always been enormous amounts of fragmentation, some of it because of institutions and the very low electoral thresholds initially, some of it because of an inability to agree on policy, and some of it because the personal politics have been so tendentious. But I think in both Poland and Hungary, what's happening now is that there's opposition on the right and there's opposition on the left. And they find it very difficult to talk to each other and to collaborate in ways that would still basically preserve them as electoral entities. And that basically means it's difficult to mount a sort of credible challenge to peace or to peace.
Can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
Is that the case, or because you would expect there to be a similar dynamic with the parties on the right to them just be squeezed out of by peace? The same way that, Fidesz squeezed out Jobbik, or almost squeezed out Jobbik. But I was wondering whether it's because the left, any opposition that creates a coalition with the left is still discredited by the specter of return of communism or return of communist ideas or something like that. So in other words, for credible opposition to emerge, it would have to basically be from center to left. And that is sort of like still impossible because of that regime divide that you wrote about also.
I think the days of, so I think peace very much wants to portray politics this way, that, the entire Fourth Republic is tainted by this, by communism and by these communist concessions and compromises that took place during the roundtable negotiations and afterwards. Most voters no longer view it this way, right? The regime divide no longer exists as far as voters are concerned. But what there isn't is a communist successor party that could sort of, somehow represent that side of the regime divide anyway. And so I think instead what's happening is like, if you look at sort of, whether it's Nowy Ład or Nowoczesna or, any of these small parties, even if they stand for sort of a center leftish set of sentiments, but they're never able to articulate them coherently, and they're never able to really form coalitions. And then you have, people like Szymon Hołownia, who represents an entirely different sort of, view of where Polish politics would be heading, that makes compromises with those leftish parties also impossible. So I think this is much more about sort of, the trade-off between, on one hand, an electoral coalition that would allow them to mount a credible response to peace, And on the other hand, that kind of electoral coalition totally eroding their individual identities and eroding their standing with the voters who want to vote for them as individual parties, as opposed to an anti-peace coalition.
You guys have all done such a fabulous job at engaging the audience that we have a large number of questions. And so I did want to try to get to some of those. There's a few questions by different people that in one way or another are asking about Poland's relationship with the international community, in particular with other countries, whether that's clashes with the Czech Republic or whether it's the role of the international community in trying to engage and slow down the perceived democratic backsliding in Poland. And I thought maybe Anna could start, and then Monika and Genevieve, if you have things to add, you might be able to contribute as well.
So I don't want to repeat myself, since I think we already talked about the United States and the EU quite a bit, but I would love to sort of talk about, there are some questions here about the future of Poland and Hungary in the EU. And I'm sort of wondering, my personal take is that they'll continue to be members and they'll continue to fester as members. But I'd love to hear what Monika and Genevieve would think about that. I mean, what's the future of Poland and Hungary in the EU?
Yeah, I mean, the way the EU institutions and especially the party system within the EU is set up, it's very costly to kick out, to say deprive Hungary or Poland, especially Hungary, of voting rights. So the institutions of the EU were designed for a united Europe. So they very much tend towards supermajoritarian, which is why the EU institutions are so slow, which is why, the reaction of the EU following the packing of the courts by peace came, a year and a half after the fact, after the protests, after the mobilization, which is why, vaccination rates in the EU were so much delayed relative to Europe, because everything moves very slowly. They move all together, but it just takes time. But I wanted to go back to the United States, because you mentioned that the US has had very little influence. Adam Szczerbiec, in a book published a few years ago, uncovered, well, maybe somebody else uncovered it, but he wrote about it, about the role of the US and especially a Republican think tank in creating AWS, which to me was a huge eye-opener, especially in light of everybody criticizing intervention in elections in 2016 in the US. And then you suddenly read about that the only reason that Solidarity came back with such a big bang in the form of AWS was on the funding of this. It was essentially the Republican equivalent of I think it was the Democratic Republican Institute. I forget the acronym now, but it was the equivalent of the NED of the Republican Party, and that AWS party actually contained both members of PO, what is now PO, and of Peace, who then went their separate ways. So the US, I think, can make perhaps not openly, maybe can't openly influence what happens in Poland, but it certainly has a lot of backdoor influence.
Sure, but I think we can say the same thing, for example, for Germany, where Merkel and basically funded the rise of GERB in Bulgaria, right? I mean, there are all kinds of connections like this, and of course, there are the foundations where the Eberhard, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and others that also played a huge role in funding their brethren parties across the borders. So I would never say that there's no influence, especially from the United States, and goodness knows that Solidarity wouldn't have survived had it not been for a massive informal influx of aid in the early 1980s. So I don't think, those kinds of informal sub rosa connections are definitely there. And I'm sure there are many more to be uncovered. But I think as a matter of formal policy, there's little that the United States can do to influence the shape of the regime in Poland right now, right? The days where you can withhold foreign aid or where you can make things conditional on meeting a set of thresholds are long gone. These are now sovereign, autonomous, and largely self-sufficient countries where the EU plays a much greater role than the United States, the United States could ever play. But that doesn't mean that foreign actors don't have, quite a bit of interference.
Although to get back to the EU, I've been in France for all year, and the COVID situation and the vaccination issue has been, even, in France, where they're huge supporters of the EU, very pro-EU, and the critique of how heavy the bureaucracy is, how slow everything is. Look at how Britain, the UK vaccinated quickly, etc. I mean, so it will be interesting to see how other national elections, what happens, which kind of parties win in France and Germany, that are less pro-EU, critical of the EU, and how that might also impact the anti-EU sentiment in Poland, how it can legitimize that anti-sentiment. So it's not just a Brexit, there's a growing sentiment that the institutions don't really work. They don't work for the good stuff, and then they don't really work in reining in things like, Hungary, what's happening in Hungary and in Poland. And actually, when the EU tried to with the court issue, for example, the EU was trying to force the hand of Poland to backtrack on that. And actually, it was just helping anti-EU sentiment because they're infringing upon Poland's sovereignty. So it's actually, in terms of symbolic politics and in terms of policy, it's a difficult. EU is really at a crossroad, and they need to find something to make it worth people like fighting for it. It seems to me.
I think you've touched on something really important, which is the utter failure of symbolic politics by the EU, right? And Kate McNamara has this fantastic book about sort of the construction of an European identity through everything from the Euro coin to the Eurovision contest, right? But those are not, those efforts are only partial, and they're not particularly well coordinated, and they haven't done a good job of explaining to people why it is that it's a great thing you're in the EU. Right. And so the Brexit vote, becomes much more sort of, about national sovereignty and finally taking back what's our own, as opposed to a weighing of the costs and benefits of staying in the European Union. And I think in some ways we're sort of holding the European Union to, this is an oil tanker, and we're expecting it to move like a sailboat. It's very good at sort of major institutional change. It's very good at trade regulation. It's very good at enforcement of a specific set of rules. It's horrible at a rapid response to anything, whether it's COVID, whether it's foreign relations, whether it's China. This is not how it functions. And if we could sort of moderate our expectations of the EU and act accordingly, that might be, and have the EU actually act accordingly, right? Because the EU generates these expectations as well, and then fails them time and time again.
As much as I personally would love to pass an hour speaking on the EU with all of you, and maybe I will arrange that for next semester, because I, of course, want to jump in. We have some questions on Poland, which are actually somewhat connected to this. There's a question about the diminishing role of civic education in schools. And there's another question about arts practices, civil society, visual arts, theater. And while they're not exactly connected, I'm wondering if maybe you can think about the changing role of civil society and education and identity, but in the Polish context, as opposed to the EU context. And maybe there's an intersection there. And just to try to answer some of the questions for the attendees, Anna.
Sure. So I think, the sort of whole idea of civic education in Poland has always been incredibly contentious, right? Government after government has tried to sort of, advocate for some kind of a specific way of presenting what Poland is, what its history is, who Poles are. But that's what every government does. I mean, I love the fact that French civics textbooks were open up with, we are all Gauls. Which, of course, it excludes the vast immigrant population in France. And I think,
that's the point.
It's exactly, right? It's a sort of, a symbolic re-engineering of identity. And so I think those efforts, are something that all governments try and do. I think what's fantastic about Poland and the sort of civil society in the artistic space, in that it almost has shown itself immune to that, right? I mean, so, the sheer vibrance of sort of, of the art sector, of various festivals, of sort of, the creation of very different identities. I mean, Genevieve, I think, is actually the person that we should talk to about this. I mean, what's happening in Kazimierz, the sort of creation of, a Jewish identity without Jews, right? I mean, there's sort of an amazing amount of efforts to bring all kinds of very diverse, very sort of multifarious, and very sort of anti-monolithic ways of understanding what Polishness is across the cultural space and across the civil society space. I mean, Genevieve, I'd love to hear what you think of that.
Well, I mean, I think that actually these kind of cultural spaces are very important ones, especially in the youth, that tends to be less politicized, less political. They think they're not political, but actually when they volunteer to renovate, not renovate, but restore a cemetery, or when they learn, Hebrew or Yiddish or whatever, it isn't a political act. It's a political act of Poland is not what peace in the Catholic Church is saying. Although that movement also precedes the coming to power of peace. So it's not a reactionary movement. It's one that actually came in the late 1980s, etc. But I think that there's a lot of vitality in the cultural sphere, and that where people are skeptical of the political process, they invest in cultural opposition. And you see it in the Jewish revival, but you also see it in all sorts of artistic production and in the women's marches too. All the graphic artists, and I see, Monika, you have the Konstytucja, like graphic artists are taking up political work that way. And that's, in Poland has historically been very strong, because the arts and culture was a way where you could actually openly or surreptitiously make political claims. So I think that's really symbolic politics. Again, that's a way, that's a lot of the space where opposition is happening.
So the question is whether, oh, sorry.
So no, go ahead, Monika.
No, I was just going to say very briefly, the question is whether this, civil society awakening will be able to make up for the weakness of the opposition parties.
Right.
Well, I think it might, that goes back to my initial question about, whether there's like a quiet or quieter revolution starting. If people leave the church, then peace that loses its big ally. That's also a way. I mean, it's not, the weakening, and you had a question too about whether denationalization or the collapse of nationalism in Poland would come through secularization. I think that there's a secularization of national identity that's been ongoing now for several years. There's a secularization of institutions. What remains is people still going to church and still somehow supporting a system that way. But even affiliation, it went from 96% and now it's 90% of Poles who identify as Catholic. That's a big drop, actually, of people.
But religion
I'd be wary of those figures, because look at places like Greece, for example, right? Greece has something like 14% church attendance rates. Almost, belief rates are all over the place, and affiliation is also pretty low. But fundamentally, something like 80% of Greeks don't think you can possibly be Greek and not be Greek Orthodox, right? And the Greek Orthodox Church plays an outsized role for reasons different than the Catholic.
Like Quebec, Anna, where people, no one goes to church, sure, but still they think of themselves as still Catholic. They're anti-Catholic. The kind of religion they reject is Catholicism also. That's plausible within 20 years in Poland.
But religious instruction in schools has something like doubled or tripled since the 90s. So I'm like striving to see where the secularization of institutions is happening, and those are the the future generations who, I guess,
actually even in religious instruction in recent data shows that it has dropped about 15 points. So I don't know, maybe I'm over optimistic. You're optimistic, Anna, that peace is not gonna, destroy everything. I'm optimistic in thinking that it might be, especially over, you know, sexual politics and women's rights, it might really be something that's going to make a difference pretty soon.
So I think I unfortunately, because it's the era of Zoom, have another Zoom to go to. But before I go, I just wanted to thank everyone so much, the audience for the questions, my co-panelists for the brilliant conversation, and Amie and Bob for making it all possible. So thanks everyone. Thank you. And my apologies. I have to run.
It's always good to leave something on the table.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you to all of the attendees.
Thank you.
Thank you.